What's going on, YouTube? Welcome to Oh So Simplified Learn, where I give you that simplified education that you need and deserve. And in this channel, I focus pretty much primarily on taking things I've learned from books, distilling it down into actionable knowledge that you can put right into your life today. So let's jump into this. Just for a little bit of housekeeping, for these first 10 videos, it's going to basically be like a course of the 10 most impactful books of my 20s. I'm about to be 29 in 2 weeks, so about to be outside of the 20s very shortly. But let's jump into this one. So this book, if you know anything about me, my favorite book of all time, Mastery by Robert Greene, also consequently is my favorite author as well. So this book I've read multiple times. I think the first time I read it I was around 21, 22. Gave me a great perspective, and just to give you like a brief synopsis about what the book is. It is a book that is somewhat, it's basically a book about becoming a master in any domain or field. And I use that word very loosely and broadly because it's not like a field like, oh, I'm going to be in sales or I'm going to be in the medical field. It's kind of like what you were born to do or what your particular inclination is, and developing that so that you can have what he calls the ultimate power of humans, which is mastery. So the way that he starts this off, the first point I want to, and I'm going to separate this into 3 points. The first point is about discovering your calling, and that's kind of how he starts off the book right after he sets the stage, and I'll kind of combine that within. So the first thing is about you being a completely unique being. So the idea that your environmental and biological circumstances are something that will never ever be repeated in that perfect mix ever again in history. And that is something that you can look at as like, you know, I'm a unique snowflake, but then also from a very realistic scientific standpoint, that is true, that, you know, nobody will ever have your mix of biology and then also be in the environment that you grew up in the time, in the place, in the exact way ever again. So with that, you have unique inclinations that are specific to you that nobody else will fully grasp but yourself. And being able to follow that is being one of the biggest parts of becoming a master, because to attain mastery, it has to be something that you're deeply drawn to and have a particular inclination to. And he specifically talks about how, like, thinking about things that you were drawn to when you were young, things that have always come natural to you, is like a good way of kind of figuring out what that calling is. And then he calls it a vocation. So vocation, he goes to kind of the etymology of the word, so the root of the word and where it comes from. And it comes from, I think it came from like the church is how he explains it. But basically vocation, like voice, vocal, comes from like to speak. So it's kind of this inner voice that's talking to you, that's telling you different things you should do. And anybody, you know, that's been through any amount of life can kind of attest to, you know, this inner voice that kind of guides you, kind of helps you make decisions. It's like, why do you want to do certain things? Why are you attracted to certain things? And then there's ways to deafen it, and there's ways to kind of silence it. You know, things like addiction, drinking, smoking are ways of avoiding it and not listening to it, or going through the conventional pathways of certain things that might not be aligned with your natural inclinations. But he really talks about discovering your calling in the beginning as becoming very attuned to what makes you you, what makes you unique, what makes you tick, what makes you different, and what is this particular inclination or voice that is inside of you that is driving you to make the decisions day to day, and not to silence it, to listen to it, and to follow it. That is definitely how he, you know, kind of starts the book and starts like the framework of attaining mastery as something that you should do. The second piece he talks about is the apprenticeship phase, and the 2 parts that are really kind of aligned with that are submitting to reality and finding a mentor. So what submitting to reality just means is that you can't come into anything with the assumption that you know everything. I don't know who said it, but somebody that was pretty freaking smart said that we stand on the shoulders of giants, or everything I do I stand on the shoulders of giants. Paraphrasing it, got it a little bit wrong. But I digress. So it's kind of the idea that you don't know everything about your field when you get into it, and if you think you know everything about your field, you're kind of delusional. And there is these norms and ways of thinking and best practices and conventional knowledge that whatever field you're learning, you have to absorb that, and you have to submit to the reality that you need to absorb all of that information. And the fastest way to absorb that information is finding the right mentor. And he talks about this as, once again, you have to kind of understand your particular inclination, because you have to find somebody that would fit with your personality and what you're trying to do. And that doesn't necessarily even mean that you want to find somebody just like you. You want to find somebody that you know you can learn from, you know you can benefit from. And there's certain personality types which he kind of goes through in different ways of finding mentors that you can do it. So you know, submitting to reality, and then finding that mentor is the next thing. And he talks about how books can be like early on mentors, and so you can learn some skills that are even of value to a real person mentor. And the reason why he talks so much about a person being a mentor is because they can cut the learning curve. And he kind of talks about this as part of the thing that makes humans humans. That one, we have mirror neurons, so when we watch somebody do something, we can really absorb them better if we're in the presence. If anybody's learned to, you know, do any sport, it is much easier to learn to ride a bike by just watching somebody pick up a bike and ride a bike than if somebody tried to explain it to you, or if somebody tried to write it in a book. There is just something about like just watching and watching somebody do it, and then watching you and kind of giving you feedback, that there is nothing that can replace that. And that is something that we have been ingrained to do. And in the dark ages, they kind of codified it into what they called an apprenticeship, which was like a 7-year contract that you would learn under a master of something, and then you would do your masterpiece, and then you become a journeyman. So that's a big part of, you know, finding the mentor and finding the right mentor to learn from. Then beyond that, he talks about the point at which you have to break off. So at a certain point, you have to surpass the master, basically. And there's this phrase he uses, it's from like a Spanish martial art of some sort, and basically the phrase, when it's translated to English, is that to the master goes the knife. And what this means is that there is a certain point where, you know, the protege becomes better than the master, and at that point, you know, in a martial art, they can basically beat you or stab you in that kind of sense. And the stabbing is kind of important in the regard of it's not always going to be a positive break. Now obviously you would want it to be a positive break, you'd want it to be kind of an amicable thing when you go on your own. Like he talks about Leonardo and Verrocchio. It didn't seem like there was a lot of resentment that was involved in that expansion when Leonardo wanted to kind of go to the next, Leonardo da Vinci and Verrocchio. He wanted to kind of exceed past Verrocchio and do his own thing. But people like Michael Faraday and Gary Davey, it was an extreme break that, you know, was never repaired till they both died. Wolfgang Mozart and his dad, basically when he left Salzburg, I believe it was Salzburg, but when he left wherever the town that they were from, basically it was a break that was never reconciled. He never saw his dad again. But if they didn't break away at those pivotal points after they gained all the knowledge, when their master was trying to hold them under their thumb, they would never have made the breakthroughs through history in their particular field. So it's one thing that at a certain point you have to submit to reality and learn, and then be willing to learn from a mentor and be humble and have that humility. But at another point, you have to realize when you've learned all you can learn from the conventional wisdom, and at this point you need to kind of break the rules. And I like mixed martial arts and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, that is kind of what a purple belt represents. So once you get to the purple belt level, you have learned all the moves. All of the moves in a tournament are in. At this point, you have to start to learn your own style. You have to start to actually break some of the rules and bend the rules depending on your particular, you know, style. And you have to kind of develop your style to get to the brown and to the black belt at that point. So at a certain point, you have to supersede. The third one that I want to get to is the social intelligence. And this is actually going to be a segue into the second book in the 10 book course that I'm going to do for the beginning of this channel, and that's social intelligence. So the main idea with this is that every single thing you do is done within a social context. So, there are people that are purists in the world that, believe that, especially in like the science fields and things like that. And Nikola Tesla is a great example of that, where he didn't believe business and, kind of the profit motive was like very important in terms of scientific breakthroughs. And that's why when we look back, besides Elon Musk, who's brought the word Tesla back into focus, Thomas Edison has like he basically gets all of the credit for all of the work that Nikola Tesla did, because he understood the social aspect and the business aspect, that he was the marketer of, these breakthroughs and made them into more commercial uses, which gave him the credit. And Nikola Tesla wasn't like, if you know who he was as a person, he didn't believe in any of that. He was a pure scientist through and through. And the big story that he uses in the book is actually very interesting for this time. It is about Semmelweis. And Semmelweis was actually the first person to understand the theory that that basically is what we use to create vaccines, who actually Louis Pasteur is credited to finding, and that's why the word pasteurized, it's basically dubbed from him. So what happened with Semmelweis, just to kind of give you this story, because I think it's very interesting with the current times that we live in, especially with this whole pandemic going on, is that basically he realized that he was like a Hungarian doctor, but he basically realized that a bunch of surgeons were killing women while they were giving birth, because they were operating on people and then they were delivering babies, and they weren't scrubbing their hands in a specific procedure to kind of clean them, and basically they were just infecting these women by putting dirty hands into their vagina, and then they would get a sickness and die. And the sickness was kind of rampant. It was something that was unexplained. Nobody knew why. And it was something that people had even observed. There was more happening when surgeons delivered the baby as opposed to midwives. But at that point, because of the way people viewed social stature, that surgeons' hands were clean, it was kind of a blasphemous thing to say. He basically proved it. He had his own ward at a point, and he basically implemented this standard, and he basically cut all of that mother mortality when they're giving birth down. But the proper social way of promoting that is to create a study, to do like a clinical trial and things like that. When you hear those words in the medical community, he never really wanted to do that. When he did do it, he didn't do it in the correct way, and he kind of just became a crazy person and died in like an insane asylum. And most of the times when you hear this story, because I've heard this story multiple times, Robert Greene tells it very different. Most people blame it on people's lack of ability to understand, somebody when they have a breakthrough. But the piece that they miss is that there was a social way that he could have promoted this. And in the book, he goes very deep into this. And it was actually more of Semmelweis' fault that he didn't have the social acuity and social adeptness and social just understanding of how you promote something, and that, you can't just force people to come to your side. You have to do things with a level of finesse. There is a social game, and no matter what you do, no matter if you're, writing books, or no matter if you're an astronaut that's going to be going to Mars for 3 years, like there is a social part and there's a social component that you need to master as well to actually be a master in any field. And that's like a big part that he focuses on. And actually, because it was so popular in the mastery book, he actually spun it off to write his following book, which is The Laws of Human Nature, which I'll go into too, because I think that is also a very phenomenal book. But that's really it for this one. This is my favorite book of all time. If you're a person that's especially if you're a younger man, or you're a younger person in general, or you're somebody that's just kind of trying to look for some kind of direction, this is a great book to provide it. I mean, the Audible's good. This is good. It's a little bit dense to read. Like if you read this isn't like a self-help book style, in the sense that like he's writing stories from history. He writes in a very like more technical manner that it's much more difficult to read than your average self-help book, I'll say. So like you're watching this and you're like, yeah, I've read a bunch of self-help books. This might take a little bit longer, so maybe you want to get the audiobook, but there is something that I think you get from reading it physically. The way he writes, the style he writes is very unique, and this to me is book number one most impactful book on my life. So that's it for this one. You like the content, like, comment, subscribe. You mess with the vibe, welcome to the tribe. If you want to see my other channels, just look in the link in the description below. And until next time, you know what it is. Peace out.